They say a man who has loved and lost becomes either a saint or a monster. Lucien Valmont became both, and the Empire never forgave him for it. The night Grand Duke Lucien Valmont announced his second marriage, the imperial court didn't celebrate. They mourned. Not for the bride, whoever the desperate fool might be, but for themselves. Because they knew what was coming. The man who had locked himself inside Blackthorn Castle for 3 years, who had let his grief turn to ice and his ice turn to cruelty, was about to drag some poor woman into his nightmare. And everyone who had ever whispered about the first Duchess's death, everyone who had ever smiled at the rumors of ghosts in the corridors, suddenly felt the ground shift beneath their feet. Because if Lucien Valmont was willing to marry again, it meant he had stopped caring what anyone thought, and a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous creature alive. Stay with me through the darkness ahead. You'll want to see how this ends. The announcement came on a Tuesday, which somehow made it worse. Tuesdays were for tax reports and supply requisitions, not for upending the social order of an entire empire. But Lucien Valmont had never cared much for propriety, and by the time his letter reached the imperial palace, half the noble houses in the capital were already in chaos. The letter itself was 4 lines long. No flowery language, no appeals to tradition or requests for blessing. Just a statement of fact. Grand Duke Lucien Valmont would marry Evelyn Marrow of House Marrow at the end of the month. The ceremony would be private. Attendance was not required. Chancellor Cedric Vane read it 3 times before he believed what he was seeing. He stood in his office on the palace's eastern wing, sunlight cutting through the tall windows and casting his shadow long across the marble floor. The letter trembled slightly in his hands, not from fear, never from fear, but from something closer to disbelief, maybe even excitement. 3 years, 3 years of careful planning, of slowly isolating Lucien from court, of letting the rumors about Blackthorn Castle grow wild and terrible until even the emperor hesitated to summon the Grand Duke for counsel. 3 years of watching Lucien bury himself alive in that fortress of stone and regret. And now this. Cedric set the letter down on his desk, smoothing it flat with fingers that had signed death warrants and trade agreements with the same steady hand. His reflection stared back at him from the polished wood, a handsome man in his late 40s, silver threading through dark hair, the kind of face that inspired trust without demanding it. A knock at the door. "Come in," Cedric said, not looking up. The door opened and Lord Matthias Crane entered, young and ambitious and utterly predictable. He carried a folder of reports that Cedric didn't care about, but the boy was useful for errands and had the good sense to keep his mouth shut when told. "Have you heard?" Matthias asked, closing the door behind him. "About the Grand Duke. Everyone's heard," Cedric said. "Half the court is convinced he's gone mad. The other half thinks he's already killed this girl and is just waiting for the wedding night to make it official." Matthias laughed, sharp and cruel. Who would marry him? After everything, someone desperate. Cedric picked up the letter again, studying the signature at the bottom. Lucien's handwriting was still the same, bold, aggressive strokes that looked like they might cut through the paper. Someone with nothing left to lose. Like House Marrow. Cedric smiled. Exactly like House Marrow. He remembered House Marrow well. Old nobility, respectable wealth, a name that carried weight in the eastern provinces. Then came the scandal 2 years ago. Lord Marrow caught embezzling from imperial grain shipments, his wife dying of shame before the trial even concluded, their fortunes seized and their titles stripped to barely above commoner status. The family had been left with nothing but a crumbling estate and 2 children, Evelyn and her younger brother. The brother was currently awaiting trial for debts he couldn't pay, the kind of debts that ended with a noose or a labor camp. Cedric had made sure of that personally. "So the girl sells herself to the monster to save her brother," Matthias said. "How touching." "How convenient," Cedric corrected. He set the letter aside and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. The capital spread out below, glittering and alive. "Do you know why Lucien Valmont frightens people, Matthias? Because he killed his first wife? Because he doesn't pretend anymore?" Cedric's reflection in the glass was calm, almost serene. Most men at his level of power learn to smile when they want to scream, to bow when they want to break necks. Lucien never learned that skill. Or he learned it and decided it wasn't worth the effort. Either way, he's honest in his violence, and honesty is terrifying. Then why let him marry again? Because a man in love is a man with weaknesses. Cedric turned from the window, and a man with weaknesses can be controlled. Matthias frowned. You think he'll love this girl? I think he'll try not to. Cedric returned to his desk, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. But trying not to love someone is just another way of admitting you could. And once he does, once he lets himself care about something again, we'll have the leverage we need to bury him completely. He began writing, the scratch of his pen the only sound in the room. What should I do? Matthias asked. Find out everything you can about Evelyn Marrow, her habits, her friends, her fears. I want to know who she is before she walks into Blackthorn. And send word to our contact in the castle. Tell them the game begins the moment she arrives. Matthias bowed and left. Cedric finished his letter, a carefully worded note of congratulations to the Grand Duke full of warmth and false sincerity, and sealed it with wax. Then he leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. 3 years ago, the first Grand Duchess had stumbled onto his secret. She'd been clever, too clever, digging through financial records and questioning shipments that should have gone unnoticed. She'd been days away from exposing him when the carriage accident happened. Such a tragedy. Such perfect timing. Lucien had suspected, of course. Lucien always suspected. But suspicion without proof was just paranoia, and Cedric had made sure every thread that might have led back to him was cut clean. Now Lucien was bringing another woman into Blackthorn. Another potential problem, but also another opportunity. Cedric smiled at nothing in particular and began planning his next move. The day Evelyn Marrow agreed to marry the Grand Duke, it rained so hard the road to Blackthorn turned to mud and memory. She sat in the carriage with her hands folded in her lap, watching the forest close in around her like a fist. The trees here were old and gnarled, their branches twisting overhead until the sky disappeared behind a canopy of black leaves and darkness. No birds sang, no wind moved through the undergrowth, just silence and the steady drum of rain against the carriage roof. The driver hadn't spoken to her since they left the capital. Evelyn didn't blame him. She probably wouldn't have spoken to her either. The letter from Grand Duke Valmont had arrived 3 weeks ago, delivered by a courier who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The wax seal had been black, appropriate, she'd thought at the time, for a man who lived in perpetual mourning. The contents were even more stark than his reputation suggested. Miss Marrow, your brother's debts will be cleared and his freedom secured in exchange for marriage. You will live at Blackthorn as Grand Duchess. You will attend court functions as required. No affection is expected or offered. Respond within 2 days. No preamble. No courtship. Not even a signature. Just his seal stamped at the bottom like a brand. Evelyn had read it once, folded it carefully, and walked to the prison where her brother was being held. Oliver had been thin, so thin, his face hollowed out by fear and bad food. He'd tried to smile when he saw her through the bars, but it came out wrong, shaky and desperate. They're saying 6 years hard labor, he'd whispered. Evie, I won't survive that. She'd held his hand through the bars and lied. You won't have to. 2 days later, she'd sent her response to the Grand Duke. One word, yes. No conditions, no questions. Just acceptance of the devil's bargain. And now here she was, riding through a forest that looked like it wanted to swallow her whole, on her way to marry a man the entire empire called a murderer. The carriage lurched over a fallen branch and Evelyn braced herself against the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, she caught glimpses of the landscape beyond. Cliffs dropping away into mist, stone ruins half buried in moss, a broken watchtower standing sentinel over nothing. This was the Blackthorn region, the northernmost territory of the empire, where winter came early and stayed late, and the land itself seemed hostile to human life. Lucien Valmont's ancestors had built their fortune here, mining iron and silver from the mountains, but the current Grand Duke had let the mines close and the villages empty. People said he preferred it that way, preferred the isolation, preferred to be alone with whatever guilt or madness haunted him. The trees finally parted and Blackthorn Castle appeared through the rain. It was worse than Evelyn had imagined. The castle rose from the cliffs like a scar, all black stone and sharp angles, towers jutting up into the storm clouds like broken bones. No lights burned in the windows, no flags flew from the battlements. It looked less like a home and more like a tomb someone had forgotten to seal. The carriage rolled through the main gates, iron, rusted, hanging slightly crooked, and into a courtyard that should have been full of servants and ceremony. Instead, there were 3 people waiting: an old steward holding an umbrella that did nothing against the sideways rain, a maid who looked terrified, and standing apart from both of them, perfectly still in the downpour, the Grand Duke himself. Evelyn's breath caught. She'd seen portraits of Lucien Valmont before, formal paintings commissioned before his first marriage, but they'd done him no favors. They'd tried to soften him, to make him look civilized and approachable. The man standing in the courtyard was neither. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed entirely in black that made him blend into the castle behind him, dark hair plastered to his skull by the rain, a face that might have been handsome if it wasn't so cold, sharp jaw, prominent cheekbones, eyes the color of winter storms. He didn't move as the carriage stopped, didn't step forward to greet her, just stood there watching, rain streaming down his face like he couldn't feel it, or didn't care. The driver opened her door and Evelyn stepped out into the storm. The rain hit her immediately, soaking through her traveling cloak in seconds. She stood there, water running into her eyes, staring at the man she'd just agreed to marry. Lucien Valmont stared back. "Miss Marrow," he said. His voice was deep, rough, the kind of voice that didn't bother with pleasantries. "You came." It wasn't a question, but Evelyn answered anyway. "I gave my word." Many people give their word. Few keep it when they see this place. He gestured vaguely at the castle, at the rain, at the whole miserable scene. "Should I have run?" Evelyn asked, then immediately regretted the sharpness in her tone. But Lucien almost smiled. "Almost. Yes. You should have. Then why invite me?" "Because running would have been the smart choice, and I needed someone desperate enough to make the stupid one." The word should have hurt, should have made her angry. Instead, Evelyn felt something close to relief. At least he was honest. At least he wasn't pretending this was anything other than a transaction. "My brother," she said, "will be released tonight. Debts cleared. A small stipend provided to start over. He'll never know the details of our arrangement. Thank you." "Don't thank me." Lucien finally moved, turning toward the castle entrance. "Thank your own desperation. That's what bought his freedom, not my generosity." He walked away without waiting for her response, his boots splashing through puddles, rain rolling off his shoulders like water off stone. The old steward hurried forward with the umbrella. "Welcome to Blackthorn, miss. I'm Sterling, head of the household staff. This is Mary. She'll be your lady's maid. If you'll follow me, we've prepared chambers for you in the east wing." Evelyn followed, her dress dragging wet and heavy behind her, her whole body shaking from cold and something deeper. Fear, maybe, or recognition that she'd just stepped across a threshold she could never uncross. Inside, the castle was exactly what she'd expected. Dark corridors lit by torches that threw more shadows than light, stone walls bare of decoration, the smell of damp and age soaked into everything. Their footsteps echoed too loud in the silence. Sterling led her up 3 flights of stairs and down a hallway that seemed to stretch forever. Finally, he stopped at a door, produced a key, and opened it. "Your chambers, miss. Dinner will be at 8. The Grand Duke rarely attends, but you'll be informed if he requires your presence." He left before she could ask anything else. Mary lingered in the doorway, wringing her hands. "If you need anything, miss, just ring the bell. I'll be close by." She fled. Evelyn stood alone in her new prison, because that's what it was, really, a very expensive prison, and took in her surroundings. The room was large, at least. A 4-poster bed with heavy curtains. A fireplace that someone had already lit. Windows that looked out over the cliffs and the forest below. Furniture that was probably expensive but looked uncomfortable. And on the far wall, partially hidden behind a folding screen, a door she hadn't noticed at first. Evelyn crossed the room slowly, her wet dress leaving a trail of water on the floor. The door was small, almost hidden, built into the wall so seamlessly she might have missed it entirely if the firelight hadn't caught the edge of the frame. She tried the handle. Locked. Of course it was locked. Everything in this place was probably locked, sealed away like secrets too dangerous to speak out loud. Evelyn pressed her ear to the wood and listened. Nothing, just silence on the other side. She pulled back, studied the door for another moment, then forced herself to turn away. Whatever was behind it could wait. Right now she needed to get out of her wet clothes before she froze to death. But as she undressed in front of the fire, as she dried her hair and tried to stop shaking, she couldn't stop thinking about that locked door. Couldn't stop wondering what was so important it needed to be hidden in the wall of her bedroom. Couldn't stop feeling like she was being watched. Dinner was served in a dining hall large enough to seat 50 people, but set for only one. Eveline sat at the end of a table that stretched into darkness, eating food she couldn't taste, while servants moved silently in and out like ghosts. Sterling had been right. Lucienne didn't attend, didn't send word, didn't acknowledge her existence at all. She finished her meal in silence and returned to her chambers. Mary was waiting with nightclothes and a nervous smile. "Will you need help preparing for bed, miss?" "No, thank you. I can manage." Mary curtsied and left so quickly, Eveline wondered if the girl had been warned to avoid her. Or maybe that was just how everyone acted in Blackthorn. Quick, quiet, desperate not to be noticed. Eveline changed into her nightgown and climbed into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The room was too quiet, the bed too large. The whole castle felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. At midnight, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Eveline sat up, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving past her door and continuing down the hall. Then they stopped. Silence. Then the sound of a door opening and closing somewhere deeper in the castle. She should have stayed in bed, should have pulled the covers over her head and pretended she hadn't heard anything. Instead, she got up. She pulled on her dressing gown and slippers, grabbed a candle from the bedside table, and opened her door as quietly as possible. The corridor was empty, shadows dancing on the walls from torches that had burned low. She stepped out, the stone cold even through her slippers, and followed the sound of those footsteps. The hallway twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the castle's east wing. She passed locked doors and empty rooms, portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her in the candlelight. The air grew colder the farther she went, until her breath misted in front of her face. Then she saw it. At the end of the corridor, barely visible in the darkness, was another door. This one was different from the others. Older, the wood dark and heavy, iron bands running across it like restraints. And unlike every other door in Blackthorn, this one was slightly ajar. Eveline approached slowly, her candle flame flickering in a draft she couldn't feel. She reached out, pushed the door open wider, and stepped inside. The room was empty. Not empty like abandoned, empty like erased. The walls were bare stone. No furniture, no windows. Nothing but dust and shadows, and in the very center of the floor, a large rectangular shape covered by a cloth so old it had turned gray with age. Eveline crossed the room, her footsteps echoing too loud, and reached for the cloth. "Don't." She spun around, candle flame guttering, heart hammering against her ribs. Lucien Valmont stood in the doorway, still dressed in black, his face half hidden in shadow. He looked at her the way someone might look at a trespasser, cold and measuring. "You shouldn't be here," he said. The door was open. "That doesn't mean you were invited." He stepped into the room and Eveline instinctively took a step back. He was bigger up close, broader, the kind of presence that filled a space just by existing. His eyes, gray in the candlelight, storm dark, fixed on her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. She didn't. "What's under the cloth?" she asked. "Nothing that concerns you. Everything in this castle concerns me now. I live here. You exist here." Lucien moved closer, close enough that she could smell rain and smoke on his clothes. "There's a difference." "Then tell me what it is. Tell me why this room is sealed. Tell me why everyone in this castle looks at me like I'm already dead." He laughed, bitter and sharp. "Because you are. You just don't know it yet." The word should have terrified her, should have sent her running back to her chambers. But Eveline had spent 2 years watching her family fall apart, watching her father drink himself to death, watching Oliver waste away in a cell. Fear was familiar. Fear was almost comfortable. "Is that what happened to your first wife?" she asked quietly. "Did she die not knowing she was already dead?" Something changed in Lucien's face. The coldness cracked, just for a second, and underneath was something worse. Pain so deep and raw it looked like it might devour him. Then the mask came back. "Get out," he said, his voice soft and deadly. "Go back to your chambers, lock the door, And don't ever come to this part of the castle again, or what? Or I'll do what I should have done from the beginning." He stepped past her, grabbed the cloth, and yanked it aside. Evelyn's breath stopped. Underneath was a painting, a portrait, life-sized, of a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a dream. Beautiful, stunningly, impossibly beautiful, with golden hair and blue eyes and a smile that seemed to hold all the warmth Blackthorn lacked. She wore a white dress and held a single rose, and everything about the painting radiated life and joy and innocence, except for the dried blood splattered across the canvas, dark and rust-brown, covering her face and throat like a mask of violence. Evelyn couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The candlelight flickered across the ruined portrait, and for a moment the woman seemed to move, seemed to stare directly at her with eyes that knew too much. "This is what you wanted to see," Lucian said behind her. "This is what you'll find if you keep digging through places you don't belong. Death, blood, secrets that should stay buried." "Who did this?" Evelyn whispered. "Does it matter?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because if you did it, I need to know. And if you didn't—" Evelyn turned to face him, her hands shaking but her voice steady. "Then someone else in this castle is a murderer, and I'm sleeping in a room with a locked door I can't open." Lucian stared at her for a long moment. Then he covered the portrait again, plunging the woman back into darkness. "Sleep with a knife under your pillow," he said. "Lock your door from the inside, and trust no one in this castle. Not Sterling, not Mary, and especially not me." He walked past her toward the door. "Lucienne," she said, surprised at her own boldness in using his name. He stopped but didn't turn around. "Did you love her?" Silence. Long enough that Evelyn thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "More than anything, more than I should have. And it killed her." He left, and Evelyn stood alone in the empty room with a blood-stained portrait and the growing certainty that she'd just made the worst mistake of her life. But when she finally returned to her chambers, when she locked the door and climbed back into bed with the letter opener clutched in her hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in his broken confession, Lucien had been telling the truth. He hadn't killed his wife, but he knew who had. And now Evelyn was trapped in Blackthorn Castle with that same killer, playing a game where she didn't know the rules and the penalty for losing was death. The morning after Evelyn discovered the blood-stained portrait, she woke to find a dead crow on her windowsill. It hadn't been there when she went to sleep. She was certain of that. The window had been locked from the inside, the heavy curtains drawn against the cold. But now the bird lay there in a pool of its own blood, neck twisted at an impossible angle, eyes still open and staring. Someone had been in her room while she slept. Evelyn stood frozen beside the bed, the letter opener still clutched in her hand from the night before, suddenly aware of how useless it would have been against an intruder who could move through locked doors like smoke. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, to think instead of panic. This was a message, a warning. She crossed to the window, careful not to touch the bird, and looked out at the cliffs below. Dawn was breaking over the forest, gray light bleeding through storm clouds that never seemed to leave this place. The courtyard far below was empty, except for a single figure standing near the gates, motionless in the cold. Lucien. Even from this distance she could recognize him. The way he stood like he was carved from the same stone as the castle, the way he seemed to absorb darkness instead of reflecting light. He was staring up at her window, had been watching maybe when the crow was placed, or had placed it himself. Evelyn stepped back from the glass, her mind racing through possibilities that all ended badly. If Lucien wanted to frighten her into leaving, this was a grotesque way to do it. If someone else in the castle wanted her gone, they were bold enough to enter her chambers while she slept. Either way, the rules of the game had just changed. She rang for Mary. The maid arrived within minutes, her face pale and drawn like she hadn't slept either. When she saw the dead bird, her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, miss, oh no, I'll have Sterling remove it immediately." "No." Evelyn's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Leave it. I want the Grand Duke to see it first." Mary's eyes went wide. "Miss, I don't think that's wise. His Grace doesn't like to be disturbed in the mornings, especially not with evidence that someone in his castle is threatening his wife." Evelyn met the girl's frightened gaze. "I think you'll want to know." "Don't you?" Mary backed toward the door, wringing her hands. I'll inform Sterling, miss. He can decide how to proceed. Tell Sterling that if the Grand Duke isn't in my chambers within the hour, I'll be in his." The maid fled. Eveline dressed quickly, choosing the simplest gown she'd brought. Dark gray wool that wouldn't show dirt or blood, high-necked and practical. She braided her hair back from her face and studied herself in the mirror. She looked tired. Looked like exactly what she was, a woman who'd sold herself to save her brother and was now paying a price she hadn't fully calculated. But she didn't look weak. That would have to be enough. The hour passed slowly. Eveline sat in the chair by the fire and forced herself to eat the breakfast Mary had brought despite the nausea churning in her stomach. She needed her strength, needed to be sharp when Lucien arrived, because this conversation would set the tone for everything that came after. When the knock finally came, it was Sterling, not Lucien. The old steward entered with his usual impeccable composure, but his eyes went immediately to the windowsill, and something flickered across his face. Concern, maybe, or recognition. "Miss Marrow, I understand there's been an incident. Someone was in my room last night." Eveline stood, keeping her voice level. They left that as a calling card. Sterling approached the window slowly, studying the dead bird without touching it. His jaw tightened. "This is most unfortunate. I assure you the castle's security will be reviewed. Such breaches are unacceptable." "Breaches?" Eveline almost laughed. "You make it sound like an accident, like someone forgot to lock a door. The castle is old, miss. There are passages and corridors even I don't know about. It's possible. It's not possible. Not unless you're suggesting a ghost killed that bird and arranged it for me to find." Eveline crossed her arms. "Someone living did this. Someone who has access to keys and knows how to move through Blackthorn unseen. So the question isn't whether your security failed. The question is whether it was designed to fail." Sterling's composure cracked just slightly. "I would never allow harm to come to anyone under this roof. But you'd allow threats? I would prevent them if I could." The honesty in his voice surprised her. Eveline studied the old steward's face, the lines etched deep around his eyes, the way his hands trembled just slightly as he clasped them behind his back. He was afraid, not of her, but of something else, something bigger. "How long have you worked for the Grand Duke?" she asked. 32 years, since before his father died. Then you knew the first Duchess." Sterling's expression shuddered. "I did." "What was she like?" "She was kind. Too kind for this place." Sterling turned away from the window. She asked questions she shouldn't have asked, went places she shouldn't have gone. And when she died, he stopped. When she died, what? The old steward met her eyes, and for a moment Eveline saw something like warning there, urgent and desperate. "When she died, miss, the questions didn't stop. They just became more dangerous." Before Eveline could press him further, the door opened and Lucien walked in without knocking. He filled the room immediately, that same overwhelming presence she'd felt the night before, like gravity had shifted to accommodate him. He glanced at the dead crow, at Sterling, at Eveline, and his expression didn't change at all. "Leave us," he told Sterling. "Your Grace, I really think... now." The steward left, closing the door softly behind him. Lucien crossed to the window and picked up the dead bird with his bare hand, examining it with the clinical detachment of someone who'd seen worse. Much worse. "Broken neck," he said. "Clean snap. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." "I gathered that," Eveline said. "The question is who and why. The who is complicated. The why is simple." He dropped the bird back onto the sill. "They want you scared. Mission accomplished." Lucien almost smiled. "If you were truly scared, you'd have left already, packed your things and run back to the capital the moment you saw this. I gave my word. My brother's freedom depends on this marriage. Your brother is free. The contract was fulfilled the moment you arrived at Blackthorn. You could leave right now, and the terms wouldn't change." Eveline stared at him. Then why stay? He turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his eyes was worse than anything she'd seen in the blood-stained portrait. "Because you want answers. Because you're the kind of person who walks toward danger instead of away from it. Because you saw that painting last night, and instead of running, you're standing here demanding explanations. Is that why you married me? Because you knew I'd be stupid enough to investigate? I married you because you needed money, and I needed someone the court would believe was desperate enough to accept me. Lucienne leaned back against the window frame. What you do with that arrangement is your choice. But if you choose to dig into what happened to my first wife, understand that whoever killed her is still in this castle, still has power, and still has no problem eliminating obstacles, like leaving dead birds in my room. That was a warning shot. The next one won't be so gentle. Eveline felt the fear then, cold and real, but she pushed it down. She'd learned young that fear was useful only if it made you sharper, not weaker. Did you love her? You asked me that last night. You didn't really answer. Lucienne studied her for a long moment. Yes, I loved her. More than she deserved and less than she needed. And when she died, I blame myself because I should have seen it coming, should have protected her, should have known that the moment she started asking questions about imperial finances and trade routes, she was signing her own death warrant. So she was murdered. Obviously. By who? Someone powerful enough that even after 3 years, I still can't prove it. Lucian pushed away from the window. Someone who has enough reach that threatening you openly is just a reminder of how untouchable they are. Chancellor Vane. It wasn't a question, but Lucian's eyes sharpened. What makes you say that? Because he's the only person in the Empire with that kind of power. The only one who could orchestrate a murder and make it look like an accident. And because you mentioned imperial finances, the Chancellor controls the treasury. You're smarter than I thought. Don't sound so surprised. Eveline walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. If I'm going to survive Blackthorn, I need to know what your first wife discovered, what she was investigating before she died. Why would I tell you that? Because whoever left this bird in my room thinks I already know. Which means I'm in danger whether you tell me or not. She turned to face him. So you can either give me the information I need to protect myself, or you can wait for them to kill me too and live with that guilt on top of everything else. Lucienne's expression darkened. You don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking you to trust me with the truth, just like your wife trusted you. That got a reaction. Something violent flickered across his face, rage or pain or both. Don't compare yourself to her. I'm not. I'm asking if you learned anything from losing her. She didn't flinch from his anger. Because if you didn't, if you're going to make the same mistakes that got her killed, then I might as well leave now. But if you actually want to finish what she started, if you want to destroy whoever took her from you, then stop pushing me away and start treating me like an ally instead of a liability. Silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Then Lucian crossed the room in 3 long strides and grabbed her arm, not roughly but firmly enough that she couldn't pull away. His face was inches from hers, close enough that she could see the storm in his gray eyes, the barely controlled fury that lived just beneath his icy exterior. You want the truth? Fine. My wife discovered that someone in the Imperial Court has been selling military intelligence to our enemies for years. Troop movements, supply routes, defensive positions, information that's gotten soldiers killed and territories lost. She traced the leak back to someone with direct access to the Emperor's War Council. Someone trusted, someone who could make a fortune off our Empire's blood, and that someone killed her before she could expose them. Yes, Eveline's mind raced. Why not go to the Emperor directly? Because I don't know which members of the court are complicit. Lucienne released her arm. Because my wife died before she could gather enough evidence. And because the moment I start making accusations without proof, I become the next target. Or worse, they arrange an accident for the Emperor and trigger a succession crisis that tears the Empire apart. So you've done nothing. I've done everything I can without getting more people killed. He turned away. I've consolidated my own forces, blocked certain trade agreements, made it harder for information to flow out of the military command. But I can't move openly. Not yet. That's why you brought me here. Eveline's voice was quiet but certain. Not just for appearances. You needed someone new in the castle, someone they don't control, someone who could ask questions and gather evidence while they're focused on watching you. Lucienne didn't deny it. The realization should have made her angry, should have felt like another betrayal, another way she'd been used. But instead, Eveline felt something closer to clarity. This was the game. These were the rules. And now she finally understood what she was playing for. What did your wife find? She asked. Before she died. What evidence did she gather? Financial records. Letters. Shipment manifests that didn't match official reports. Lucienne walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames. She hid them somewhere in the castle, somewhere even I couldn't find after she was gone. I've torn this place apart looking, but either she was too clever or I'm not clever enough. Or someone else found them first. No. If someone found them, they'd have destroyed the evidence and stopped worrying about ghosts. The fact that they're still nervous, still leaving threats, means they know the documents exist but can't locate them either. So we find them first. Evelyn crossed her arms. Where did your wife spend most of her time? Everywhere. She loved this castle, despite everything it represented. She spent hours in the library, the gardens, even the old watchtower. Lucien's voice softened almost imperceptibly. She said Blackthorn wasn't cursed, just lonely. That it needed someone to care about it. Did she have a study? A private room? Yes. The solar on the 3rd floor. Sterling locked it after her death, and I haven't opened it since. Then that's where we start. Lucien turned to look at her. This isn't a game, Evelyn. These people killed one Grand Duchess already. They won't hesitate to kill another. I'm not playing a game. I'm trying to survive. She met his gaze steadily. And the only way to survive is to give them a reason to fear me more than I fear them. For the first time since they'd met, something like respect flickered in Lucien's eyes. You really are insane. So I've been told. He walked to the door, then paused. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't trust the servants. And if you find anything, you bring it to me directly. No one else. Not even Sterling? Especially not Sterling. Lucien's expression hardened. He's loyal, but loyalty doesn't make him immune to pressure. If someone threatens what he loves, he'll break. Everyone does, even you? He didn't answer, just left, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sounded too much like a trap snapping shut. Evelyn stood alone in her chambers staring at the dead crow on the windowsill and felt the weight of what she'd just agreed to settle over her like a shroud. She'd come to Blackthorn to save her brother. Now she was gambling her life on solving a murder that the most powerful people in the Empire wanted buried. But somewhere in this castle was evidence that could destroy them. Evidence that the first Grand Duchess had died protecting. And Evelyn had never been good at leaving mysteries unsolved. She grabbed her cloak and headed for the 3rd floor. But the solar had been beautiful once. Even now, abandoned and thick with dust, Evelyn could see traces of the woman who'd lived here. Bookshelves lined 2 walls, packed with volumes on history and philosophy and botany. A writing desk sat near the windows, positioned to catch the morning light. Dried flowers hung from the rafters, their colors faded to gray. A half-finished embroidery frame stood in the corner, the needles still threaded as if waiting for hands that would never return. It looked like someone had just stepped out for a moment and forgotten to come back. Evelyn moved through the space slowly, her footsteps muffled by a rug that had once been cream but was now dingy with neglect. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust except for one thing. The lock on the door showed fresh scratches, bright metal against tarnished brass. Someone had been here recently. She crossed to the writing desk and began opening drawers. Most were empty or contained only mundane items. Quills, dried ink bottles, scraps of paper with nothing written on them. But the bottom drawer stuck when she tried to pull it open, jammed or locked. Evelyn knelt and examined it more closely. No keyhole, just a drawer that wouldn't budge. She ran her fingers along the underside, searching for a catch or lever, and found a small indentation carved into the wood. A symbol. 2 circles overlapping, creating a shape like an eye. She pressed it. The drawer clicked and slid open. Inside was a leather journal, bound with a strap that had worn soft with use, and underneath it a folded piece of parchment sealed with wax. Evelyn lifted both carefully, her heart racing. The seal on the parchment was unfamiliar. Not the Grand Duke's black wax, but deep burgundy with a symbol she didn't recognize. She opened the journal first. The handwriting inside was delicate, precise, each letter formed with care. The first entry was dated 4 years ago, shortly after the first Duchess's marriage to Lucien. Today I became Grand Duchess of Blackthorn. Everyone at court looked at me with pity, as if I'd signed my own execution. Perhaps I have, but I've also gained access to records and correspondence that no one expected me to read. Lucien doesn't know it yet, but I'm not just a pretty face to legitimize his standing. I'm going to find out what really happens in the dark corners of this empire, and I'm going to make sure someone pays for it. Evelyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. This woman hadn't been naive or helpless. She'd walked into Blackthorn knowing exactly what she was doing. She flipped through the pages, skimming entries about court politics and suspicious financial transfers, about military defeats that seemed too convenient and trade deals that enriched certain nobles while impoverishing others. The Duchess had been methodical, building a case piece by piece, connecting dots that should have been invisible. Then, 6 months before her death, the tone changed. I found something today that I wish I hadn't. Evidence that goes beyond corruption into outright treason. Someone in the Emperor's inner circle has been selling our intelligence to the Kalen Confederacy. Not just minor information, battle plans, defensive positions, the names of our spies in their territories. I traced 3 separate payments back to a single account. The trail is complex, deliberately obscured, but I know where it leads. I can't tell Lucien, not yet. If I'm wrong, it will destroy alliances the Empire needs. If I'm right, it will start a war within the court that could collapse everything. I need more proof, concrete evidence that can't be denied, but I'm running out of time. Someone knows I'm looking. I found a dead songbird in my chamber yesterday. A warning. They think fear will stop me. They're wrong. The next few entries detailed meetings with informants, secret correspondence, and gradually building paranoia. The Duchess had known she was being watched, had known her life was in danger. But she'd continued anyway, driven by something Evelyn recognized too well, the stubborn refusal to let powerful people get away with murder. The final entry was dated the day before her death. I know who it is now. I have proof. Documents that trace the payments directly back to him. He's been careful, but not careful enough. Tomorrow I'll give everything to Lucien. He'll know what to do with it. If I don't survive the night, the evidence is hidden where only someone who loves Blackthorn will find it. Not in the obvious places. Not where Lucien would look. Somewhere deeper. Somewhere old. 2 circles overlapping. The eye that sees everything. May whoever finds this have more courage than I did. May they finish what I started. That was it. No more entries. Just blank pages after, as if the Duchess's story had been cut off mid-sentence. Evelyn set the journal down carefully and picked up the sealed parchment. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the wax and unfolded it. Inside was a single sheet covered in numbers and names, account transfers, dates, amounts, and at the center of the web, connected to everything else by lines drawn in faded ink, a name that made Evelyn's blood run cold. Chancellor Cedric Vane. She stared at the document, her mind racing. This was it. This was the proof the Duchess had died protecting. Evidence that the Emperor's most trusted advisor had been selling military secrets for years, getting Imperial soldiers killed for profit. But it wasn't enough. The document showed the connections, but not the source materials. It was a map, not the treasure. The real evidence, the letters, the financial records, the concrete proof, was still hidden somewhere in Blackthorn, somewhere deeper, somewhere old. Evelyn stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. The Duchess had left her a trail of breadcrumbs, the overlapping circles, the eye. She'd seen that symbol before, carved into... The door to the solar opened. Evelyn spun around, clutching the parchment, ready to shove it into her pocket or fight or run. But it was only Mary standing in the doorway with a tea tray, her eyes wide and frightened. "Miss Marrow, I didn't know you were up here. I brought tea for who?" Evelyn asked sharply. Mary's face went pale. "For you, miss. Sterling said you'd likely be searching the castle and would need refreshment." The lie was obvious, clumsy. Mary wasn't a good liar, which meant Sterling had sent her to check on what Evelyn was finding, or someone else had sent her for darker purposes. "Put it down and leave," Evelyn said. "Miss, I really should—" "Now." Mary set the tray on a side table with shaking hands and backed toward the door. "I'm sorry, miss. I'm so sorry." She ran. Evelyn waited until the footsteps faded, then moved quickly. She folded the parchment and tucked it into her bodice, grabbed the journal, and left the solar. Her mind was racing through possibilities and dangers, calculating who knew she was here and how long before word reached the wrong ears. She needed to find the rest of the evidence before someone stopped her. The symbol carved into wood. 2 overlapping circles. She'd seen it in her own chambers, carved into the frame of that locked door behind the folding screen. Evelyn ran. Back in her room, she shoved the folding screen aside and studied the hidden door more carefully. In the daylight filtering through her windows, she could see it clearly now. the symbol carved into the wood just above the handle, worn smooth by time and hands that had traced it long before hers. The eye that sees everything. She pressed her palm against it and pushed. The door swung open. Beyond was a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. The stone steps worn smooth in the center from centuries of use. The air rising from below smelled of earth and age, damp and cold. Evelyn grabbed a candle and started down. The stairs descended for what felt like miles, twisting deeper into the castle's foundations, until the walls changed from worked stone to rough rock. She'd gone below even the dungeons, into spaces that predated the castle itself. Ancient passages carved by people who'd lived here long before the Valmont family claimed these cliffs as their own. The staircase finally opened into a chamber. It was small, circular, the walls lined with niches that had once held offerings or treasures. Now they were empty except for one, a metal box, tarnished green with age, sitting alone in an alcove. Evelyn approached it slowly, her candlelight throwing wild shadows across the walls. The box was locked, but the mechanism was simple, old. She used a hairpin to work the catch until it clicked open. Inside were letters, dozens of them, bundled together with string, and underneath, ledgers filled with numbers and dates and transactions that matched the web on the parchment she carried. This was it, the evidence the first Duchess had died protecting. Evelyn lifted the letters carefully, scanning the contents. They were correspondence between Chancellor Vane and contacts in the Kalen Confederacy, written in careful code but with enough context that their meaning was clear. Troop movements sold for gold, supply routes traded for political favors, names of imperial agents given up for promises of power. Years of treason documented in the Chancellor's own hand. Evelyn felt something like triumph mixed with terror. She'd found it, found the proof that could bring down the most powerful man in the Empire. But now she had to get it out of Blackthorn, past whatever forces Cedric had watching the castle, and into hands that could actually use it. A sound behind her. Footsteps on the stairs. She spun around, candle flame guttering, and saw a figure descending into the chamber. For a moment she thought it was Lucian, come to find her. Then the candlelight caught the face and her blood turned to ice. Sterling. The old steward stood at the bottom of the stairs, his expression infinitely sad. "I was hoping you wouldn't find this place, miss." "I really was." Evelyn backed against the wall, the metal box clutched to her chest. "You work for him. For Vane." "I work for survival." Sterling moved into the chamber slowly, like he was approaching a frightened animal. "The Chancellor offered me a choice 30 years ago. Serve him quietly or watch my daughter hang for crimes she didn't commit. I chose her life over my honor, and I've been paying for it ever since." "You helped him kill the first Duchess." "No." His voice cracked. "I warned her to stop digging, begged her, but she wouldn't listen. And when the order came to arrange the accident, Sterling stopped, his composure finally breaking. He looked old suddenly, ancient and hollowed out by guilt. "I sabotaged the carriage wheel myself," he whispered. "Made it look like natural wear, knew exactly where it would fail on the mountain road." The old steward's hands trembled. "I killed her, and I've lived with that every day since." "Then why not just take this evidence when you had the chance?" Evelyn asked. "Why leave it here for someone to find?" "Because I'm a coward, miss. A coward who wants to be forgiven, but doesn't deserve it." Sterling reached into his coat. "So I made a different choice. I decided that when someone finally found what the Duchess hid, I would make sure they had a chance to use it." He pulled out a rolled parchment and held it out to her. "That's a map of the castle's escape routes, passages that lead outside the walls, and a letter of introduction to Captain Morris of the City Guard. He's loyal to the Empire, not to Cedric. Get this evidence to him, and he'll make sure it reaches the Emperor." Evelyn stared at the offered parchment. "Why would you help me?" "Because you remind me of her. Because I'm tired of being afraid." Sterling's voice hardened. "And because if I'm going to hell for what I've done, I'd like to take Cedric Vane with me." Evelyn took the map. "If I get caught, you'll die. Probably badly." Sterling met her eyes. "But if you succeed, you'll save more lives than you can count, including your own." "What about the Grand Duke? He can't know." "Not yet. If Lucian moves too early, Cedric will activate his contingencies. People will die." Sterling stepped back toward the stairs. "You have until tonight. After that, Cedric's agents will come looking. They know you've been asking questions. They're just waiting for orders on how to eliminate you. Evelyn felt her world narrow to this moment, this choice. Run or fight, hide or expose, live small and safe or risk everything for a truth that might destroy her. She thought of her brother, free now because she'd been willing to sell herself. Thought of the first Duchess, dead because she'd refused to look away from evil. Thought of Lucien, trapped in his castle of grief, waiting for justice he couldn't deliver himself. "I'll need a distraction," she said, something to draw attention away from the castle. Sterling almost smiled. "Leave that to me, miss. I've been planning my redemption for 3 years. I know exactly what to do." He turned and climbed back up the stairs, his footsteps fading into darkness. Evelyn stood alone in the ancient chamber, holding a box of treason and a map to freedom, and felt the weight of what came next settle over her like armor. She wasn't the Grand Duchess anyone expected, wasn't brave or noble or particularly clever, but she was desperate, and she was angry, and she had nothing left to lose except her life, which, all things considered, seemed like a fair trade for bringing down an empire's darkest secret. She tucked the box under her cloak, memorized the map, and started planning her escape from Blackthorn Castle. Evelyn waited until nightfall to make her move. She sat in her chambers as the sun bled out over the cliffs, the metal box hidden beneath loose floorboards under her bed, Sterling's map committed to memory. The escape route he'd drawn led through the oldest parts of Blackthorn, down through wine cellars and storage rooms that hadn't been used in decades, eventually emptying into a drainage tunnel that opened onto the cliffs a half-mile from the castle gates. From there, she'd have to climb down in darkness, make it to the village, and find Captain Morris before Cedric's people realized what she'd taken. Simple. Impossible. Her only chance. Mary brought dinner on a tray and wouldn't meet her eyes. The girl set the food down with trembling hands and left without a word, practically running from the room. Evelyn watched her go and felt the net tightening. Sterling had been right. They knew she'd found something. They were just waiting for the order to act. She forced herself to eat, needing the strength. The food tasted like ash, but she swallowed it anyway, washing it down with wine that did nothing to calm the fear coiling in her stomach. This was insane. She was going to die trying to escape this castle, or die trying to expose Cedric, or die simply because she'd been stupid enough to think a desperate noblewoman could bring down the Empire's most powerful man. But sitting here waiting for them to kill her seemed worse. At midnight, Evelyn changed into the darkest dress she owned, sturdy boots, and wrapped herself in a black cloak that would blend into shadow. She retrieved the metal box and tucked it into a leather satchel along with the Duchess's journal and the parchment map. Evidence. Proof. The thing that had gotten one woman killed and was about to get another one murdered if she wasn't careful. She opened her door slowly, checking the corridor. Empty. The torches had burned low, casting more shadow than light. Perfect. Evelyn moved quickly through the castle, following Sterling's map in her mind. Down the main staircase, left through the portrait gallery, right at the old armory. The castle was silent except for the wind howling against the windows and the distant sound of the sea crashing against the cliffs far below. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every sound made her heart hammer against her ribs. She reached the wine cellar without incident. The door was unlocked just as Sterling had promised. She slipped inside and pulled it closed behind her, breathing in the smell of dust and fermented grapes and stone that had been cold for centuries. Rows of wine racks stretched into darkness. Somewhere at the back, hidden behind a false wall, was the entrance to the drainage tunnel. Evelyn lit the small lantern she'd brought and started forward. She was halfway through the cellar when she heard footsteps above. Multiple people moving through the castle with purpose. Searching. Her stomach dropped. They knew. Somehow they'd figured out she was gone, or Sterling's distraction had failed, or this had all been a trap from the beginning. She ran. The false wall was exactly where Sterling had marked it, a section of stone that looked solid but swung inward when she pressed the right spot. Beyond was darkness and the smell of water, a narrow tunnel carved through rock that sloped down toward the sea. Evelyn ducked inside and pulled the wall closed behind her just as the cellar door above crashed open. Voices echoed down. Men's voices, harsh and urgent. Search every room. She can't have gotten far. What about the tunnels? Collapsed years ago. No one's used them in decades. Check anyway. The Chancellor wants her found tonight. footsteps moving closer. Evelyn turned and ran into the darkness, one hand trailing along the damp stone wall, her lantern barely cutting through the black. The tunnel twisted and turned, sometimes so narrow she had to turn sideways to squeeze through, other times opening into chambers where water dripped from stalactites overhead. The sound of the sea grew louder, a constant roar that meant she was getting close to the exit. Behind her, more voices. They'd found the entrance. The tunnel opened suddenly onto a ledge overlooking the sea. Waves crashed against rocks 50 feet below, white foam glowing in the moonlight. To her right, carved into the cliff face, was a series of iron rungs leading down to a narrow path that wound along the water's edge toward the village. Evelyn clipped her lantern to her belt and started climbing down. The iron was slick with spray, rusted and sharp under her hands. She moved as fast as she dared, not looking down at the churning water below, focusing only on the next rung, and the next, and the next. Wind tore at her cloak, salt spray stung her eyes. Her arms burned with the effort of holding on, but she kept moving because stopping meant dying. She was 20 feet from the bottom when the iron rung under her left hand broke free from the rock. Evelyn swung out into open air, her full weight suddenly on one arm, the metal box in her satchel swinging wildly and nearly pulling her loose. For a moment she hung there, suspended over nothing, the sea roaring beneath her like it was hungry for her body. Then her hand found the next rung, and she pulled herself back against the cliff, gasping and shaking. Don't look down, don't think, just climb. She made it to the path and collapsed onto solid ground, her whole body trembling. No time to rest. Behind her, lights appeared at the top of the cliff. They were coming. Evelyn forced herself up and ran along the narrow path, stumbling over loose rocks, her lungs burning. The village was close now. She could see lights through the darkness, smoke from chimneys, the shapes of buildings huddled against the cold. Safety. Maybe. If she could reach Captain Morris before Cedric's men caught up. She burst into the village square, gasping for breath, and nearly collided with a man standing in her path. Not just any man. Lucien. He stood there in the moonlight like he'd been waiting for her, dressed for travel with a sword belted at his hip, and an expression that was equal parts fury and something else she couldn't name. Behind him, 3 armed soldiers wearing the Grand Duke's colors. Evelyn stopped, her heart sinking. How did you know? Sterling sent word. Lucian's voice was cold, clipped. Told me you'd found the evidence and were running. Told me everything. The evidence. Evelyn's hand moved protectively to the satchel at her side. I was bringing it to Captain Morris. Sterling said he could be trusted. Sterling was wrong. Lucian stepped closer and Evelyn saw it then. Not anger, but pain. Raw and bleeding and barely contained. Morris has been on Cedric's payroll for 2 years. If you'd gone to him, you'd be dead before dawn and the evidence would disappear forever. Evelyn felt the ground shift beneath her. Then who? Me. You should have come to me. He grabbed her arm, not roughly but firmly. We're leaving, now, before they find you. Where are we going? The capital. We're going to end this tonight. Lucien turned and started walking, pulling her with him. His soldiers fell in around them as they headed toward horses waiting at the edge of the village. Evelyn's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Lucien had known, had been planning this, had used her as bait or ally or both, and she still couldn't tell which. They mounted and rode hard through the night, pushing the horses to their limits. The forest blurred past, dark and hostile. No one spoke. The only sounds were hoofbeats and labored breathing and the wind howling through the trees like it was mourning something already dead. 2 hours later, they reached the capital. The city was different at night, still beautiful but edged with menace, shadows pooling in doorways and alleys, the kind of darkness that hid predators and prey alike. Lucien led them through back streets, avoiding the main roads until they reached a district Evelyn didn't recognize. Expensive houses, government buildings, the kind of neighborhood where power lived and made its decisions. They stopped outside a mansion that took up an entire block, all white stone and iron gates and windows glowing with warm light. Music drifted from inside. Laughter. The sounds of a party in full swing. Whose house is this? Evelyn whispered. Cedric Vane's. Lucien dismounted and looked up at the lit windows. He's hosting the winter masquerade tonight. Half the imperial court is inside, which means we have an audience. You're going to confront him publicly. I'm going to destroy him publicly. Lucian turned to her. But I need your help. I need you to walk in there with me, stand beside me when I present the evidence, and show the court that you're willing to testify to what you found. They'll try to discredit us, call us liars and traitors and conspirators. But if you don't flinch, if you hold your ground, they'll have to listen. Eveline looked down at her travel-stained dress, her muddy boots, her hands still scraped raw from climbing down the cliff. I'm not exactly dressed for a ball. You're dressed like someone who almost died getting the truth. Lucian's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. Sometimes that's more powerful than any gown. He offered his arm. Eveline took it, and together they walked through the gates toward the mansion, 3 soldiers at their backs and a box of treason clutched in her hands. Every step felt like walking toward an execution, but she kept moving because turning back now would mean the Duchess had died for nothing. The doors opened and they stepped into light and music and a room full of people who had no idea their world was about to end. The ballroom was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers threw light across marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Silk banners hung from the ceiling in the emperor's colors, deep blue and gold, symbols of power and legitimacy. Nobles in elaborate masks and expensive gowns danced to an orchestra tucked in the corner, their laughter bright and careless. Servants moved through the crowd with trays of wine and delicacies. Everything gleamed with wealth and confidence and the absolute certainty that this was how the world worked, how it would always work. The music died when Lucian walked in. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Dancers froze. Every eye in the room turned to stare at the Grand Duke of Blackthorn standing in the doorway like an avenging ghost, covered in road dust and radiating fury, with a woman no one recognized at his side. Lucian didn't stop, didn't pause to acknowledge the stares. He walked straight across the ballroom toward the dais where Chancellor Cedric Vane stood holding court, surrounded by sycophants and admirers. Cedric saw him coming, and his smile didn't waver. If anything, it widened. Lucian, what a surprise! The Chancellor descended from the dais with practiced grace, his mask, a silver work of art shaped like a falcon, catching the chandelier light. I didn't realize you'd be attending tonight. You usually avoid these frivolous gatherings. I'm not here for the party. Lucian stopped 5 feet away, close enough for the entire room to hear, but far enough to avoid looking like a brawler. I'm here to expose you for the traitor you are. Silence crashed through the ballroom like a physical thing. Cedric's smile never slipped. I beg your pardon? You've been selling Imperial military intelligence to the Kalen Confederacy for 7 years. Lucian's voice carried through the room, cold and precise. Troop movements, supply routes, strategic positions. Information that's gotten hundreds of soldiers killed and cost the Empire 3 provinces. You orchestrated the death of my first wife when she discovered your treason. And you've spent the last 3 years trying to cover your tracks. Cedric laughed. It sounded genuinely amused. Lucien, I understand you've been under considerable strain since your wife's tragic accident, but these delusions... I have proof. Eveline stepped forward and held up the metal box. Letters in your handwriting. Financial records showing payments from Kalen accounts to shell companies you control. Ledgers documenting every piece of intelligence sold and every soldier's life you traded for gold. The room erupted. Nobles surged forward, some demanding to see the evidence, others shouting that this was clearly some kind of conspiracy against the Chancellor. The orchestra scrambled to pack their instruments. Servants pressed themselves against the walls. Someone called for the city guard. Cedric held up one hand and somehow the chaos subsided. His expression remained calm, almost pitying. Miss Marrow, I've heard about you. The desperate daughter of a disgraced house, willing to do anything to salvage her family's reputation. He turned to address the crowd. Tell me, how much did the Grand Duke pay you to fabricate these accusations? Or did he simply threaten you the way he threatens everyone who dares to question his increasingly erratic behavior? I'm not being paid and I'm not being threatened. Eveline's voice shook but held. I found this evidence hidden in Blackthorn Castle. The first Grand Duchess gathered it before she died. She was investigating you because she knew something was wrong, and you had her killed to silence her. Prove it. The command came from a new voice. The crowd parted, and Emperor Hadrian walked through, flanked by Imperial guards. He was younger than Eveline expected, maybe 40, with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much compromise and not enough justice. He moved with the careful dignity of someone who knew their authority was always being tested. Your Majesty. Cedric bowed smoothly. I apologize for this disruption. The Grand Duke has clearly suffered a break from reality. I'll determine what's real and what isn't. Hadrian's voice cut through the Chancellor's smooth deflection. You claim to have evidence, Grand Duke? Lucian gestured to Eveline. Show him. She approached the Emperor, opened the metal box, and spread the contents across a nearby table. Letters, ledgers, the parchment map connecting everything, years of treason laid out in black ink and dried blood. Hadrian studied it all in silence. The room held its breath. Then he looked up at Cedric and something terrible flickered across his face. When was the Battle of Greyhold Pass? The question came out of nowhere. Cedric's smile faltered for just a second. 2 years ago, Your Majesty. August, I believe. We lost 300 men there. Hadrian picked up one of the letters, because the enemy knew exactly where our supply lines were, exactly where to ambush our forces for maximum casualties. He held up the letter. This is dated 1 week before the battle. It details our entire strategy, and it's signed with your seal. Cedric's mask cracked. Your Majesty, I can explain. Don't! Hadrian's voice went cold. Don't insult me with lies. I've suspected for years that someone close to me was feeding intelligence to our enemies. I just never wanted to believe it could be you. He turned to the Imperial Guards. Arrest him. The guards moved forward. Cedric stepped back, his hand moving to his belt, and suddenly there was a knife in his palm. He grabbed the nearest noble, a young woman in a blue gown, and pressed the blade to her throat. Everyone in the room froze. Let me leave, Cedric said. His composure was completely gone now, replaced by something desperate and vicious. Let me walk out of here and I'll release her outside the city. Try to stop me and she dies. The young woman whimpered. Blood welled where the knife pressed against her skin. Hadrian held up a hand, stopping the guards. You can't run forever, Cedric. There's nowhere in the Empire you'll be safe. Then I'll leave the Empire. Cedric backed toward the door, dragging the woman with him. I've made enough money selling your secrets. I'll buy myself a kingdom somewhere that doesn't ask questions. He was almost to the exit when Eveline moved. She didn't think about it, didn't plan it, just saw the letter opener still tucked in her satchel, the one she'd kept under her pillow at Blackthorn, and acted on instinct. She grabbed it and threw. The blade wasn't balanced for throwing. It spun awkwardly through the air, more luck than skill. It caught Cedric in the shoulder, not a killing blow, but enough to make him flinch, his grip on the knife loosening. The young woman twisted free, and Lucien was already moving, crossing the distance in 3 long strides. He hit Cedric like a storm, driving him into the wall with enough force to crack the plaster. The knife clattered to the floor. Lucien's hand closed around Cedric's throat. For years I've wanted to kill you. For years I've dreamed about watching you die. His voice was barely human, all ice and murder. You took her from me. You destroyed the only good thing in my life because you were too greedy to stop stealing. Cedric clawed at Lucien's hand, gasping for air. Lucien! Hadrian's voice cut through the moment. Don't. Let him stand trial. Let the Empire see what he is. Lucien didn't move. His hand stayed locked around Cedric's throat, his eyes full of years of rage and grief finally given a target. Kill him now and it's over. Justice done. One monster erased from the world. Then you're no better than he is. Eveline spoke quietly, but everyone heard it. You want him dead or you want him destroyed. Because death is quick. But standing trial, being stripped of everything, dying in prison knowing the whole empire despises him, that's forever. Something shifted in Lucien's expression. Slowly, deliberately, he released Cedric and stepped back. The Chancellor collapsed, gasping and coughing. The guards moved in immediately, chains rattling. They bound Cedric's hands and pulled him to his feet. His mask was gone. His composure was gone. All that was left was a middle-aged man who'd gambled on greed and lost everything. As they dragged him toward the door, he looked back at Eveline. You think you've won? His voice was hoarse, broken. You've just painted a target on your back. I wasn't the only one profiting from those sales. There are others. Nobles, generals, people who'll do anything to keep their crimes buried. And they'll come for you. Then we'll be waiting. Lucien moved to stand beside Eveline. All of us. Everyone whose lives you destroyed for profit. Cedric laughed, bitter and sharp. You're both dead. You just don't know it yet. They took him away still laughing. The ballroom erupted into chaos again, nobles arguing, some defending Cedric, others demanding investigations into who else was complicit. Hadrian called for order, but no one was listening. The music was over. The masks were coming off. The Empire had just discovered rot at its core, and no one knew how deep it went. Evelyn felt herself start to shake. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by the reality of what had just happened. She'd thrown a knife at the Empire's chancellor, had helped expose treason, had stood in front of the emperor and the entire court and refused to back down. And now, according to Cedric, she was a target for everyone who'd been part of the conspiracy. Lucien's hand found hers, steady and warm. We need to leave. Before they start asking questions we can't answer in public. The emperor, Evelina whispered, will summon us tomorrow. Hadrian might be shocked, but he's not stupid. He knows he needs time to figure out who else was involved before this becomes a full revolution. What about Sterling? Already on his way to the capital. I sent word for him to seek sanctuary at the Imperial Palace as soon as you left Blackthorn. He'll testify to his own crimes and name everyone he knows was working with Cedric. Lucien guided her toward a side door. He's buying his redemption with information. It's the only currency he has left. They slipped out of the mansion into the cold night air. The soldiers were waiting with horses. Evelyn mounted numbly, her mind struggling to process everything. They'd done it. They'd actually exposed Cedric Vane. The first Duchess's death would have meaning now. Justice would be served. But Cedric's warning echoed in her head. There are others. Where are we going? She asked as they rode through the empty streets. Somewhere safe. Lucien's expression was grim. Or as safe as anywhere can be when you've just declared war on half the imperial court. They rode through the capital as dawn began to break, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Evelyn watched the city wake around them. Merchants opening shops, workers heading to factories, people living their ordinary lives with no idea that the foundation of their government had just cracked wide open. She'd come to the capital a desperate noblewoman with no options. Now she was a witness to treason, a target for assassins, and the second Grand Duchess of Blackthorn who'd survived what killed the first. Nothing about her life would ever be ordinary again. They reached a safe house in the merchant district as the sun rose fully. Lucienne led her inside, through corridors and locked doors, finally stopping in a room with heavy curtains and furniture that had seen better days. Not a palace, but defensible. Safe enough. You should rest, he said. Tomorrow the Emperor will want full testimony, and it's going to be brutal. They'll try to discredit everything we've presented. Evelyn nodded, but made no move toward the bed. She was exhausted, but too wired to sleep, her mind racing through everything that had happened and everything that might come next. Lucien, she said quietly, that night in the ballroom, when you had your hands around Cedric's throat, would you have killed him if I hadn't spoken? He was silent for a long moment. Yes, I think I would have. Why didn't you? Because you reminded me what my wife would have wanted. She didn't die just to see Cedric dead. She died trying to save the Empire from people like him. Finishing what she started means doing it the right way. Making sure the truth comes out and the guilty are punished under law, not vengeance. He turned away from her, staring out the window at the city beyond. She loved this place. Loved the Empire despite all its flaws. She believed it could be better. And I'd forgotten that in 3 years of grief and rage. He looked back at Evelyn. You reminded me. I didn't do anything. You refused to give up. You kept digging even when it would have been smarter to run. You stood in front of the Emperor and the entire court and held your ground. Lucien's expression softened. That's everything. Evelyn felt something shift between them. Not love. It was too soon for that, too complicated, too weighted with ghosts. But recognition, maybe. Understanding. Two people who'd been forced into roles they never wanted, discovering they were stronger together than apart. What happens now? She asked. Now we survive. Lucien moved toward the door. We testify. We help Hadrian root out everyone involved in the conspiracy. We watch our backs because Cedric was right. There are others, and they'll come for us. And we find a way to live with the fact that we won the battle, but the war is just beginning. He paused in the doorway. I'm glad you came to Blackthorn, Evelyn. Even if I never said it, even if I pushed you away. I'm glad you were desperate enough to marry a monster because you saved me from becoming one. He left before she could respond. Evelyn stood alone in the safe house and felt the weight of everything settle over her like a second skin. She'd come to the capital to expose a traitor. She'd succeeded. The chancellor who'd sold the empire's secrets was in chains. Justice was being served. But somewhere in the city, people were waking up to the news and realizing their own crimes might be next. People with power and resources and every reason to make sure Evelyn Marrow never testified in front of the emperor. She'd lit a fire that would burn through the imperial court like plague, and now she had to survive the flames long enough to see it through. Outside the window, the city glittered in the morning light, beautiful and treacherous and full of people who would kill her the moment they got the chance. Evelyn pulled the curtains closed and locked the door and finally allowed herself to feel the fear she'd been pushing down all night. She was trapped in the capital with enemies on every side. She had no family, no fortune, no protection except a grieving Grand Duke and a box of evidence that made her the most dangerous woman in the empire. And the only way forward was to walk back into that ballroom full of predators and make them listen to the truth even if it killed her, which, all things considered, seemed increasingly likely. Evelyn woke to the smell of smoke. Not the clean smoke of fireplaces or cooking fires, but something chemical and wrong, the kind of smoke that meant destruction. She jerked upright in the unfamiliar bed, her heart already racing, and saw orange light flickering beneath the door. Flames. The safe house was burning. She rolled out of bed and hit the floor as the window exploded inward, glass spraying across the room. A figure in black dropped through the opening, blade already drawn, moving with the kind of precision that came from killing for money. Professional, efficient, here to make sure she never testified. Evelyn grabbed the iron poker from the fireplace and swung hard. The assassin blocked with his blade, but the impact knocked him off balance. She didn't wait. Drove forward with the poker like a spear, caught him in the ribs, heard bone crack. He stumbled back toward the broken window and she hit him again, this time in the head. He went down hard. The door burst open and Lucien was there, sword drawn, his face illuminated by firelight and fury. "Are you hurt?" "No." Evelyn's hands shook, but her voice held. "But they're burning the building." "I know. There are at least 6 more downstairs. Someone leaked our location." He grabbed her arm and pulled her into the corridor. "We need to move now." Smoke filled the hallway, thick and choking. They ran through it half blind, following Lucien's lead as he navigated by memory through rooms that were already engulfed in flames. Heat pressed against Evelyn's skin like a living thing. Her lungs burned. She could hear the building groaning, timber supports giving way as fire consumed everything. They reached the stairs and found 2 more assassins waiting. Lucien didn't slow down. He hit the first one before the man could raise his weapon, driving his sword through the assassin's chest with the kind of violence that spoke to years of rage finally unleashed. The second one swung at Evelyn, and she blocked with the poker, the impact jarring her arms, then kicked him in the knee hard enough to hear something pop. He went down screaming, and Lucien finished him with a slash across the throat. No hesitation, no mercy, just survival stripped down to its most brutal form. They burst through the front door into the street and found chaos. The entire block was burning, people screaming and running in every direction. Lucien's 3 soldiers were fighting a half-dozen more assassins in the street, blades flashing in the firelight, blood already pooling on the cobblestones. The Empire's response to their testimony had arrived. "This way." Lucien pulled her away from the main fight, heading down an alley that ran between burning buildings. Behind them, shouts and the clash of steel. Someone was orchestrating this attack with military precision, trying to eliminate everyone who'd been at the safe house before dawn broke and the city watch arrived in force. They were halfway down the alley when a figure stepped out of the shadows ahead. Not an assassin. Lord Matthias Crane, Cedric's young protege, dressed in fine clothes and holding a crossbow aimed directly at Evelyn's chest. "End of the line," he said. His voice was steady, almost apologetic. "Nothing personal, just business." Lucien moved in front of Evelyn, putting himself between her and the crossbow. "Let her go. She's not your target. She's the only witness besides Sterling who can testify to finding the evidence." Matthias shrugged. Cedric's arrest left a power vacuum. Several of us who were benefiting from his arrangement have decided to fill it. But we can't do that with her alive. Your children playing at treason. Lucien's voice was cold. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. We know enough. We know the Emperor is weak. We know half the court is corrupt. We know that power in this empire goes to whoever is willing to take it. Matthias's finger tightened on the trigger, and we know that dead witnesses can't destroy what we've built. Everything seemed to slow down. Evelyn saw the bolt release, saw Lucian move, saw him twist to push her aside, felt his body slam into hers, driving her to the ground, heard the wet thunk of the bolt hitting flesh. Lucian grunted and went down. The bolt had caught him in the shoulder, punched through muscle and bone, and emerged bloody on the other side. He hit the cobblestones hard, his sword clattering away, and for a moment he just lay there bleeding. Evelyn screamed his name and grabbed for his sword. Matthias was already reloading. "Move and you're both dead." She didn't care, closed her hand around the sword's grip, and came up swinging. The blade was too heavy, unbalanced in her untrained hands, but she swung it anyway with all the desperate strength she had. Matthias dodged back and the crossbow came up. "Drop it, or I put the next bolt through your heart." Evelyn held the sword steady despite her shaking arms. "You'll have to." For a moment they stood frozen, predator and prey locked in a stalemate that could only end one way. Then footsteps behind Matthias, running fast. He spun, and Sterling emerged from the smoke, old and tired, and holding a knife that looked too big for his frail hands. The steward didn't say anything, just drove the blade into Matthias's back with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done terrible things before and was doing them again for the last time. Matthias's eyes went wide. He dropped the crossbow and fell to his knees, blood spreading across his expensive shirt. Sterling stood over him, breathing hard, looking every one of his 70 years. "That's for the Duchess," he said quietly. "Both of them." Matthias collapsed and didn't move again. Sterling helped Evelyn pull Lucian upright. The Grand Duke was conscious but pale, blood soaking through his shirt, his breathing shallow and pained. The bolt had missed anything immediately fatal, but he was losing blood fast. "We need to get him to the palace," Sterling said. "The Emperor's physicians can save him, but we need to move now. The streets are full of assassins. Then we fight through them." Sterling's expression was grim. "I didn't betray 2 Grand Duchesses just to let this one die in an alley." They half carried, half dragged Lucian back toward the main street. The soldiers had finished off most of the attackers, but 2 were down, dead or dying. The survivors formed up around them as they moved through burning streets toward the palace district. Every shadow looked like another threat. Every sound made Evelyn's heart hammer against her ribs. They were 3 blocks from the palace when the real ambush hit. 20 men in Imperial Guard uniforms poured out of side streets and surrounded them. Not assassins dressed as guards, actual city watch who'd been bought or blackmailed or convinced that eliminating these troublemakers was patriotic duty. Led by a captain Evelyn didn't recognize, a hard-faced man with dead eyes and a sword already drawn. "By order of the Imperial Council, you're under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and the murder of Lord Matthias Crane." The captain's voice carried over the sound of the fires. "Surrender your weapons and you'll be held for trial." Trial. Like that wasn't just another word for execution. Lucian managed to lift his head despite the pain. The Emperor gave no such order. The Emperor is no longer making decisions. The Imperial Council has voted to assume temporary authority until this crisis is resolved, which means your protection is gone. Now drop your weapons or we'll cut you down where you stand. The soldiers around them tensed, 4 of them against 20, impossible odds, suicide. Sterling stepped forward, his old voice somehow carrying authority. "I am Sterling Blackwood, steward of Blackthorn Castle. I have information about every noble involved in Chancellor Vane's treason. Names, dates, payments. Kill us, and that information dies. Let us reach the Emperor, and I'll testify to everything." The captain smiled. "We already have Cedric Vane. We don't need your testimony. You have Cedric, but not the dozen other nobles who helped him. Not the generals who looked the other way. Not the council members who profited from every soldier's death." Sterling's hands were shaking, but his voice held firm. "Kill me, and they all walk free. Let me testify, and I'll tear this empire's corruption out by the roots." The captain considered this for a moment. Then he raised his sword. "I'll take my chances." He moved forward, and everything exploded into violence. Lucian's soldiers met the city guard with desperate fury. Steel rang against steel. Men screamed and died. Blood sprayed across cobblestones already slick with it. Sterling went down under 2 guards, his knife taking one in the gut before the second one ran him through. The old steward collapsed with a look almost like relief on his face, like this was the ending he'd been waiting for. Eveline found herself back to back with Lucien, both of them holding weapons they could barely lift, surrounded by guards closing in for the kill. This was it. The end of everything. They'd exposed Cedric Vane, and it hadn't mattered because the corruption ran too deep, touched too many powerful people who would rather burn the empire than face justice. Then the palace gates burst open and imperial cavalry poured into the street. Real imperial guards, not corrupted watch, led by a woman in commander's armor who took in the scene with one glance and started barking orders. The city watch broke and ran. The few who stood their ground were cut down in seconds. It was over so fast Eveline barely processed what had happened. The commander dismounted and approached Lucien, who was now sitting on the ground, too weak from blood loss to stand. "Your Grace, the Emperor sent us when word reached the palace about the fires. He wants you and Miss Marrow brought to him immediately." "Sterling," Lucien said, his voice barely above a whisper. The commander glanced at the old steward's body. "We'll see to him. Right now you need a physician or you're going to bleed out." They loaded Lucien onto a horse, and Eveline climbed up behind him, holding him upright as they rode the last blocks to the palace. He was shaking, his skin cold with shock, his blood soaking into her dress. She kept talking to him, nonsense words, just trying to keep him conscious until they reached help. "Stay with me. We're almost there. Don't you dare die after everything we've survived. Not planning on it." Lucien's voice was faint, but he managed a ghost of his usual dry tone. Would be embarrassing to survive assassination just to die of blood loss. They reached the palace and physicians swarmed them immediately. Someone pulled Eveline off the horse. Someone else cut Lucien's shirt away and started working on the wound with efficient brutality. Eveline watched them carry him inside, watched his blood leave a trail on the marble floors, and felt something in her chest crack open. She couldn't lose him. Not now. Not after everything. "Miss Marrow." A servant touched her arm gently. "The Emperor wants to see you." Eveline followed in a daze through corridors that blurred together, past guards and courtiers and nobles who stared at her like she was a ghost. She was covered in blood, her dress torn and scorched, her face streaked with soot. She looked like she'd walked through hell, which, she supposed, she had. The Emperor was in his private study, not the throne room, which somehow made this worse. More personal. More real. He stood when she entered, and his expression was a complicated mix of anger and respect, and something that might have been fear. "Miss Marrow, I owe you an apology." Hadrian gestured to a chair, but Eveline remained standing. "I underestimated how deep this corruption runs, how many people would kill to keep it hidden. Sterling is dead." Eveline's voice came out flat. "He died protecting the evidence, died trying to make things right." "I know." Hadrian's jaw tightened. "And his death won't be for nothing. The Imperial Council that ordered your arrest has been dissolved. Every member is under investigation. The palace is being purged of anyone connected to Cedric's network." "How many?" "Hundreds. Maybe more." The Emperor looked older suddenly, tired and worn down by the weight of his own government's betrayal. "It's going to tear the Empire apart, but it has to be done." "What about Lucien? The physicians say he'll survive. The wound is serious but clean." "He was lucky." Hadrian studied her face. "You love him." Wasn't a question, but Eveline answered anyway. "Don't know. Maybe. Or maybe I just refuse to let another person die because of this conspiracy." That's close enough to love for most people. The Emperor moved to the window, looking out at the city. The sun was rising, painting everything gold and red. "You've destroyed the comfortable lies this empire was built on. Exposed the rot we'd all been pretending didn't exist. Do you understand what that means? It means people are angry. It means you've made enemies of everyone who profited from those lies. Everyone who looked the other way while soldiers died and territories fell. You've painted a target on your back that will never fade." Hadrian turned to face her. "I can offer you protection, position, wealth, but I can't promise you safety, not anymore." "I never had safety," Eveline said. "I had desperation and a brother who needed saving and a choice between being a victim or being something else." She met the Emperor's gaze. "I chose something else." "Then choose this too. Stay in the capital. Testify at the trials. Help me rebuild what Cedric and his allies destroyed. Be the symbol this empire needs right now. The woman who refused to be silenced even when it would have been easier to die. And if I say no, then you're free to go. I won't force you. But Blackthorn Castle will feel very empty without anyone to give it life. And the Grand Duke will have to face what comes next alone. Evelyn thought about running, about taking her brother and disappearing into some province where no one knew her name or what she'd done, living small and safe and anonymous. Then she thought about the Duchess's portrait covered in blood, about Sterling's last moment of redemption, about Lucien's hands around Cedric's throat, years of rage finally given a target. People didn't get to choose whether monsters existed. They only got to choose whether to fight them or become them. I'll stay, she said. I'll testify. But I want something in return. Name it. I want immunity for my brother, complete amnesty for his debts and his crimes. I want him free to start over without his sister's choices destroying his future. Done. Hadrian nodded. What else? I want Blackthorn Castle open to families ruined by noble corruption. The ones who lost everything because people like Cedric decided profit mattered more than lives. Make it a refuge, a place where they can rebuild. The Emperor smiled slightly. The Grand Duke won't like that. Then the Grand Duke can get over it. Evelyn's voice hardened. That castle has been a tomb for too long. It's time it became something useful. Anything else? Yes. She took a breath. When this is over, when the trials are done and the Empire is stable again, I want the truth about the first Duchess made public. I want her name cleared and her sacrifice recognized. She deserves more than being remembered as a tragic accident. She'll have it. I promise you. Hadrian extended his hand. Welcome to the fight, Grand Duchess Marrow. May you survive it longer than most do. Evelyn shook his hand and felt the weight of what she'd just committed to settle over her like armor. There was no going back now, no safe exit. She'd thrown herself into the heart of the Empire's civil war, and the only way out was through. The Emperor dismissed her, and she walked back through the palace toward the medical wing where they'd taken Lucian. Her body ached. Her mind felt like it was fracturing from exhaustion and shock. But she kept moving because stopping meant thinking about Sterling's body in the street, about the soldiers who'd died protecting her, about all the blood that had been spilled to get this far. She found Lucien in a private room, bandaged and pale but conscious. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted, softened, became almost vulnerable. They're saying you negotiated with the Emperor, he said, that you turned down his offer to leave. I did. Why? Because someone has to see this through. Because the Duchess started something that deserves to be finished. Evelyn moved to sit beside the bed. Because running seemed like betraying everyone who died to get us here. Lucien was quiet for a moment. Then, Sterling? Dead. Died buying us time. He stabbed Matthias Crane in the back and then took a blade himself. She swallowed hard. He said it was for both duchesses. He got his redemption then. Lucien closed his eyes. More than he deserved, but probably exactly what he needed. They sat in silence, listening to the palace wake around them, the sounds of a government in crisis trying to hold itself together. Outside, the sun was fully up now, bright and merciless, illuminating a city that would never be the same. You shouldn't have stepped in front of that crossbow, Evelyn said finally. You could have died. So could you. That's why I did it. Lucien opened his eyes and looked at her directly. I've already lost one wife to this conspiracy. I wasn't going to lose another. I'm not her. No, you're not. You're harder than she was, more willing to do terrible things if they're necessary. His mouth quirked slightly. You're more like me. Is that supposed to be a compliment? It's supposed to be the truth. Lucien's expression grew serious. The trials are going to be brutal. They'll attack your character, your motives, your past. They'll call you a liar and a conspirator and a gold digger who seduced me into this plot. They'll try to destroy you. Let them try. Evelyn felt something cold and certain settle in her chest. I've been destroyed before. I survived it. I can survive it again. I know. That's why I married you. He reached for her hand and she let him take it. Not because you were desperate, because you were strong enough to do what needed doing even when it hurt. Their fingers intertwined, scarred and blood-stained and holding on like lifelines. Outside the room, footsteps approached. Voices raised in urgent discussion. The palace was mobilizing, preparing for whatever came next. Trials, purges, probably riots in the streets as the empire learned exactly how corrupt its government had been. The door opened and the emperor's secretary entered, carrying a stack of documents that looked ominous. Miss Marrow. Your Grace, the trials begin tomorrow at noon. The emperor wants you both present to testify. He looked apologetic. I'm afraid there's more. We've intercepted messages suggesting another assassination attempt is planned for the courthouse. Multiple conspirators still at large. The palace guard will provide protection, but it won't be enough, Lucian finished. It never is. We're doing everything we can. I know. And it still won't be enough. Lucien sat up despite the obvious pain, his face set in grim determination. So we'll do what we've been doing. We'll walk into that courthouse knowing we're targets, and we'll testify anyway. We'll give the Empire the truth even if it kills us. The secretary nodded and left. Eveline looked at Lucien and saw her own acceptance reflected in his eyes. Tomorrow they would stand before the imperial court and destroy what was left of Cedric's network. Tomorrow they would paint even bigger targets on themselves. Tomorrow they would find out if truth and justice actually mattered in an empire built on comfortable lies. And if they died trying, at least they'd die as something other than victims. Lucien squeezed her hand once, gentle and fierce. Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together, Eveline finished. No more running, no more hiding. We finish what she started. He nodded. What they both started. The first Duchess and the second. Different women with different strengths, but united by the same stubborn refusal to let evil win just because fighting was dangerous. They sat together in the medical room as the palace descended into controlled chaos around them. Two people who'd been forced into marriage by desperation and conspiracy, now bound by something deeper. Not love, not yet, but partnership forged in blood and fire, and the shared understanding that some battles were worth dying for. Tomorrow would bring assassins and accusations, and the full weight of the Empire's corruption turned against them. Tonight, they prepared for war. Outside the windows, the city burned with fires that hadn't been fully extinguished, smoke rising into a sky that promised more violence, more blood, more impossible choices. And somewhere in the palace dungeons, Chancellor Cedric Vane sat in chains and smiled, because he knew what they didn't yet. Destroying him was just the beginning. The real monsters were still free, and they were coming. The imperial courthouse stood like a monument to justice that had never really existed. Eveline stared up at its marble columns and bronze doors as dawn broke over the capital, painting everything in shades of blood and gold that felt too appropriate for what was about to happen. The building was surrounded by imperial guards in full armor, crossbowmen on the rooftops, barricades blocking every approach. The emperor was taking no chances, not after the fires, the assassinations, the revelation that his own government had rotted from the inside. But all the guards in the world couldn't protect against the kind of violence that came from desperation and fear, the kind that made powerful men do terrible things when their comfortable lives were stripped away. Eveline had learned that lesson well, had the scars to prove it. Lucien stood beside her, his left arm in a sling, his face still too pale from blood loss, but his eyes clear and hard. He'd refused to stay in the medical wing, had insisted on being here even though the physicians warned that reopening his wound could kill him. Some things mattered more than survival. Some truths were worth dying to defend. Ready? He asked quietly. No, but I don't think that matters anymore. It never did. Lucien's mouth quirked slightly, something that wasn't quite a smile. We stopped getting to be ready the moment we decided to fight instead of run. They walked up the courthouse steps together, flanked by guards who looked almost as nervous as Eveline felt. Inside, the grand chamber was already packed. Nobles in their finest clothes, merchants and guildmasters, military officers in dress uniform. The entire power structure of the empire crammed into one room to watch the trial that would determine whether justice actually existed or if it was just another word powerful people used to control the weak. The gallery fell silent when Eveline and Lucien entered. She felt their stares like physical pressure, judgment, and curiosity and rage all mixed together. Half these people wanted her dead. The other half just wanted to see blood spilled, didn't care whose. She'd destroyed the comfortable order they'd all profited from. made it impossible to pretend the empire wasn't built on corpses and corruption. They would never forgive her for that. Good. She didn't want their forgiveness. She wanted their fear. The judges entered. 3 senior magistrates chosen by the emperor himself, men whose careers had somehow stayed clean despite decades at court. They took their seats behind an elevated bench, and the head judge, an ancient man named Valorian, with eyes that missed nothing, called the court to order. We are here to determine the extent of treason committed by Chancellor Cedric Vane and his co-conspirators. His voice carried through the chamber like iron. To establish accountability for crimes against the empire that have cost thousands of lives and compromised our security for nearly a decade. This is not a political trial. This is an accounting. Cedric was brought in chains, flanked by guards, his wrists raw from shackles and his expensive clothes replaced with prisoner's gray. But his composure was intact. He walked with his head high, almost regal, like this was just another performance, and he was confident in his ability to control the narrative. When he saw Evelyn, he smiled. The prosecution began with Captain Morris, who'd been arrested alongside Cedric when his own involvement was discovered, testifying about payments and orders and the systematic corruption that had infected the city guard. Then came military officers who detailed how intelligence leaks had led to ambushes and defeats. Then merchants who'd been strong-armed into smuggling contracts. One after another, witnesses painted a picture of an empire systematically betrayed by the man trusted to protect it. Cedric's defense attorney, a smooth-talking bastard named Cornelius, who'd made his fortune defending nobles too powerful to face consequences, attacked every witness with surgical precision, questioned their motives, their memory, their credibility, suggested they were all part of a conspiracy against the chancellor, motivated by jealousy or political ambition or bribes from foreign powers. The court watched it all with the cold calculation of people who understood that truth mattered less than which story sounded more believable. Then Judge Valorian called Evelyn to testify. She walked to the witness stand with her head high, refusing to show the fear that made her hand shake and her stomach churn. Every eye in the room followed her. She could feel Cedric's gaze especially, amused and confident, like he already knew how this would end. Miss Marrow. Valorian's voice was neutral, but not unkind. Please tell the court how you came to discover evidence of Chancellor Vane's treason. Evelyn took a breath and began. Told them about finding the first Duchess's journal in the solar at Blackthorn. About the hidden chamber beneath the castle and the box of letters and ledgers that documented years of selling imperial secrets. About Sterling's confession and his help in getting the evidence to the capital. She spoke clearly, methodically, leaving out nothing except the parts that would sound too convenient or dramatic. Just facts. Just truth. When she finished, Cornelius stood to cross-examine. Miss Marrow, you claim to have found this evidence in a chamber sealed for 3 years. A chamber that, conveniently, no one else knew existed. His tone was skeptical, bordering on mocking. How do we know you didn't fabricate these documents yourself? A desperate noblewoman, willing to do anything to restore her family's fortune, might see an opportunity in accusing the empire's chancellor. I have no fortune to restore. My family lost everything. Manufacturing evidence wouldn't change that. But marrying the Grand Duke of Blackthorn might. Cornelius smiled. A political marriage that gave you access to wealth and position. And now here you are, the hero who exposed treason. Quite a remarkable transformation from disgraced nobody to celebrated witness. Some might say suspiciously remarkable. Evelyn felt rage rising in her chest but forced it down. The truth doesn't care about transformation. It just is. Those documents exist. The handwriting can be verified. The financial transactions can be traced. You can question my motives all you want, but you can't erase evidence. Evidence can be forged, especially by someone with access to the Chancellor's correspondence and the Grand Duke's resources. Then how do you explain Captain Morris's confession? Or the testimonies from military officers who confirmed intelligence leaks? Or the fact that your client's financial records show payments from Kalen accounts that match exactly with the dates of imperial defeats? Cornelius waved a hand dismissively. Circumstantial. Nothing directly ties the Chancellor to the blood-stained portrait does. Evelyn's voice cut through his dismissal. The first Grand Duchess was investigating this treason before she died. Someone killed her to silence her and then desecrated her portrait as a warning. That same warning was repeated when someone left a dead bird in my chambers at Blackthorn. The people who profit from this conspiracy have been willing to kill to protect it. That's not circumstantial. That's a pattern of violence that proves guilt. You're speculating, making emotional appeals instead of providing hard evidence. I'm connecting dots that your client spent years trying to erase. Evelyn leaned forward. But he made one mistake. He assumed everyone was as willing to profit from treason as he was. He assumed Sterling would stay silent forever. He assumed I'd be too frightened to fight back. He was wrong about both of us, the gallery murmured. Cornelius looked less confident now, his smooth performance cracking slightly. He asked a few more questions, but Evelyn answered them all with the same unflinching directness, refusing to be intimidated or manipulated into contradicting herself. When she stepped down, Lucien was called next. He moved to the witness stand with visible difficulty, his injured shoulder making every movement painful. But his voice when he spoke was steady, cold, the voice of a man who'd spent 3 years waiting for this moment. He confirmed everything Evelyn had testified, added details about his wife's investigation, about the suspicious circumstances of her death, about the years he'd spent trying to find proof while being isolated and vilified by court. His testimony was brutal in its honesty, admitting his own failures and mistakes, the ways grief had made him cruel and distant. But underneath all that was bedrock certainty. Cedric Vane was guilty and deserved to pay for every life he'd destroyed. Cornelius tried to break him the way he'd tried to break Evelyn, suggested the Grand Duke had fabricated evidence to justify his paranoia, implied this was revenge for a wife's death that was nothing more than a tragic accident. But Lucien didn't crack, didn't waver, just stared at Cedric with the kind of cold fury that made the temperature in the room drop. Finally, after hours of testimony, Judge Valorian called a recess. The court emptied slowly, nobles whispering to each other, calculating which way the wind was blowing and how to position themselves accordingly. Evelyn and Lucien were escorted to a private chamber to wait for deliberations. They sat in silence for a long time, exhaustion and tension making conversation feel impossible. Through the windows, they could see the city going about its business, people who had no idea that the trial determining their empire's future was happening right now in this building. "Do you think they'll convict?" Evelyn asked finally. Lucien was quiet for a moment, then, "I think they'll try to find a compromise. Guilty of corruption, but not treason. Punishment that looks severe but doesn't actually destroy him. Something that lets everyone save face and pretend justice was done." "That's not enough." "I know, but it might be all we get." Lucien turned to look at her. "The Empire doesn't want justice. It wants stability. And sometimes those things are enemies. Then we make them choose. We refuse to accept compromise. We push until they have no choice but to deliver actual consequences or openly admit they don't care about truth. That could backfire. Could turn the court against us completely." "Probably." Evelyn met his gaze. "But I didn't survive assassination attempts and burning buildings just to watch Cedric Vane get a slap on the wrist and a comfortable exile. Either the Empire stands for something real or it deserves to fall apart." Lucien studied her face for a long moment. Then he smiled, genuine and warm, the first real smile she'd ever seen from him. "My first wife believed the Empire could be saved. You make me think she might have been right." Before Evelyn could respond, a knock at the door. The guards were back. The judges had reached a verdict. They returned to the courtroom and took their seats. The gallery had refilled, somehow even more crowded than before. People standing in the aisles and pressed against the walls. Everyone wanted to witness this moment. Everyone wanted to see whether justice actually existed or if it was just another performance. Judge Valorian stood, holding a scroll, his ancient face unreadable. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, this court finds Chancellor Cedric Vane guilty of high treason against the Empire, guilty of conspiring with enemy nations to sell military intelligence, guilty of orchestrating the murder of Grand Duchess Elara Valmont, guilty of attempted murder of Grand Duchess Evelyn Valmont. His voice grew harder with each charge. "The sentence is death by execution, to be carried out at dawn 3 days hence. All assets are forfeit to the imperial treasury. All honors and titles are stripped. The name Vane is stricken from the rolls of nobility." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Nobles shouting in outrage or approval, guards struggling to maintain order. Cedric's composure finally shattering as the reality of his situation crashed down. He lunged toward the judges, chains rattling, guards grabbing him and forcing him down. "You've killed the Empire," he screamed at Evelyn across the chaos. "You think this is justice? It's suicide. There are a dozen other men in this room who've done exactly what I did. You've just declared war on all of them." "Good," Evelyn said quietly, knowing he couldn't hear her over the noise. "Let them know we're coming." Cedric was dragged away, still screaming threats and curses. The judges called for order, but it took 15 minutes to restore enough calm to continue. When the room finally quieted, Valorian spoke again. "Furthermore, this court orders a comprehensive audit of all nobles and officials connected to Chancellor Vane. Anyone found to have participated in his conspiracy will face similar charges. The Empire will be purged of this corruption no matter how high it reaches. More chaos, more outrage. Half the nobility in the room just heard their own death sentences. Evelyn and Lucien left the courthouse surrounded by guards, moving through crowds that screamed both praise and condemnation. Some people threw flowers, others threw stones. The Empire was fracturing in real time, splitting between those who wanted justice and those who profited from its absence. They made it back to the palace as dusk fell, both of them shaking from exhaustion and the weight of what they'd just set in motion. The Emperor met them in his private study, looking years older than he had that morning. "You've torn the Empire apart," Hadrian said without preamble. "3 nobles have already fled the capital. 2 more have barricaded themselves in their estates. The military is split between officers who support the purge and those who see it as a witch hunt." He rubbed his face. "This is going to get worse before it gets better." "It has to," Lucian said. "You can't cure infection by leaving half the disease intact." "I know, but knowing doesn't make it easier." Hadrian looked at them both. "I'm authorizing the formation of a special tribunal to investigate everyone connected to Cedric's network. You'll both serve on it. Your testimony today proved you're willing to speak truth regardless of consequences. The Empire needs more of that." "How long will this take?" Evelyn asked. "Years. Maybe a decade." The Emperor's expression was grim. "But when it's done, we'll have either rebuilt this empire on honest foundations or watched it collapse entirely. Either way, the comfortable lies are over." They left the palace as night fell fully, riding through streets that felt charged with violence waiting to happen. Lucien was silent, lost in thoughts Evelyn couldn't guess at. She let the quiet stretch, understanding that some moments didn't need words. They reached a townhouse the Emperor had provided for their use, safer than Blackthorn, closer to the palace, heavily guarded. Inside, servants had prepared rooms and meals they were both too exhausted to eat. Evelyn went to her chambers and stood at the window, looking out at the city, at the lights glittering in the darkness, at the empire they'd just declared war on. A knock at her door. Lucien entered without waiting for permission, still moving carefully because of his injury. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for everything, for not running when anyone with sense would have, for standing beside me in that courtroom even though it painted a target on your back that will never fade, for finishing what she started. She would be proud of you." Evelyn turned from the window. "Your first wife. She died trying to save the Empire, and you actually did it. You made her sacrifice mean something." "We did. Not just me." Lucian moved closer. "You could have taken the Emperor's offer to leave, could have disappeared with your brother and lived safely somewhere far from all this. But you stayed. I made a promise." "To who?" "To myself." Evelyn's voice was quiet but certain. "I spent 2 years watching my family fall apart, being powerless to stop it. I swore that if I ever had the chance to fight back against people who destroy others for profit, I'd take it. This was that chance. And now I see it through, no matter how long it takes." She met his gaze. "What about you? You've spent 3 years in grief. Now that you've gotten justice, what comes next?" Lucien was quiet for a long time, learning to live again, learning that revenge and justice aren't the same thing, learning that maybe I don't have to be the monster everyone believes I am. "You were never a monster, just someone in too much pain to be anything else. That's generous. Most people wouldn't be so understanding." "Most people didn't see you step in front of a crossbow bolt." Evelyn smiled slightly. "Monsters don't do that." They stood there in the lamplight, 2 people who'd been forced together by desperation and conspiracy, discovering that somewhere along the way they'd become something more. Not lovers, not yet, maybe never, but partners bonded by shared trauma and the understanding that some battles required two people willing to stand back to back against the world. The Duchess loved Blackthorn, Lucian said suddenly, believed it could be more than a place of grief and isolation. You offered to turn it into a refuge for families destroyed by corruption. I want to help with that. Want to make it the kind of place she would have been proud of. Then we will. Together. The word hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to examine. But it felt right. Felt like the beginning of something that might eventually become hope. 3 days later, Evelyn stood in the palace courtyard at dawn and watched Cedric Vane die. The execution was public, attended by thousands. The emperor wanted everyone to see that justice applied even to the most powerful, wanted the message clear. Corruption would be punished, no matter how high it reached. Cedric went to the block with his head high, refusing to show fear even at the end. His last words were addressed to the crowd, a final performance from a man who'd spent his life manipulating perception. You think this changes anything? You think killing me purges the Empire's sins? He laughed, sharp and bitter. I'm not the disease. I'm just the symptom. The Empire was built on exploitation and lies. It always has been. Killing me just makes you feel better about participating in it. The axe fell and Cedric's head rolled into the basket. The crowd roared, some in approval, some in horror. Evelyn watched it all with a strange detachment, feeling less satisfaction than she'd expected. Justice had been done, but it felt hollow somehow, incomplete. Cedric was right in one way. Killing him didn't fix the Empire's fundamental problems. It just removed one parasite from a system that bred them. The real work was just beginning. Over the following months, the tribunal Evelyn and Lucian served on uncovered layers of corruption that made Cedric's crimes look almost quaint by comparison. Military contracts awarded to incompetent nobles, tax revenue diverted to private accounts, laws written specifically to protect criminal enterprises. Judges bought, officials blackmailed, an entire system of government built on the assumption that power meant immunity from consequences. They dismantled it piece by piece. Nobles were stripped of titles and fortunes. Officers were court-martialed. Entire departments of government were purged and rebuilt. Some fled the empire rather than face trial. Others fought back, hiring assassins and spreading propaganda and doing everything possible to preserve their comfortable corruption. The attempts on Evelyn's life became routine. Poison in her wine, a sniper's bolt that missed by inches, a fire set in the townhouse that guards caught before it spread. She learned to live with constant vigilance, to check every shadow and trust no one completely. It was exhausting. It was necessary. It was the price of trying to build something better on the ruins of what had been. Through it all, Lucian was there, not as her protector or her husband, but as her partner, fighting the same battles, carrying the same weight. They spent long nights reviewing evidence and planning raids and trying to anticipate which corrupt official would make the next move against them. They learned each other's rhythms and weaknesses and strengths, learned to work together with the kind of synchronization that came from shared purpose and mutual respect. Somewhere in those months, respect deepened into something else, something neither of them was quite ready to name, but both recognized in the way they gravitated toward each other, the way their conversations stretched longer, the way silence between them felt comfortable instead of tense. One evening, 6 months after Cedric's execution, they sat together in what had become their shared study, surrounded by documents and law books and half-empty glasses of wine. Outside, winter was settling over the capital, the first snow of the season falling soft and silent. "I got a letter from Oliver today," Evelyn said. "He's in the southern provinces working as a clerk for a shipping company. Says he's happy. Says thank you for giving him a second chance. He earned it." Lucien looked up from the ledger he was reviewing. By not letting his sister's choices define his future. "Our choices define everything." She smiled slightly. "That's what the Duchess believed, right? That we're not trapped by circumstance. That we can choose to be better than the world expects. She believed people were capable of change if they wanted it badly enough." Lucien set down the ledger. "I'm starting to think she was right. Because of the tribunal? Because of you." He met her eyes. "You've changed this empire more in 6 months than I managed in 3 years of rage and isolation. You've proven that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to give up even when giving up is the logical choice." Eveline felt something warm bloom in her chest. That's not power, that's just stubbornness. It's both. And it's why this empire might actually survive what we've done to it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. The only sound, the crackle of the fire and the soft whisper of snow against windows. Eventually, Lucian stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city blanketed in white. I've been thinking about Blackthorn, he said, about what it could become. I want to start renovations next spring. Open it to the families we talked about. Turn it into something useful. I'll help. We can design it together. I'd like that. Lucian turned to look at her. I'd like a lot of things I never thought I'd want again. A purpose beyond revenge. A future that looks like more than just survival. He paused. Someone to share it with. Eveline's breath caught. Are you asking? I'm saying that somewhere between wanting you dead for interfering and watching you face down the entire imperial court without flinching, I forgot how to imagine doing this without you. Lucian crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, his expression more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. I'm saying I don't want this to be a marriage of convenience anymore. I want it to be real. Eveline looked at him. This man who'd been called a monster, who'd isolated himself in grief, who'd learned to be human again through violence and justice and the slow, painful process of letting someone past his walls. She saw the scars he carried, physical and emotional, the weight of loss that would never fully leave him. Saw also his strength, his stubborn refusal to let corruption win, his capacity for change. I don't know if I love you, she said honestly, but I know I don't want to do this without you either. I know that when you were shot, I thought my heart would stop. I know that I trust you more than I've trusted anyone. Maybe that's close enough to love for now. It's more than enough. Lucienne took her hand, scarred fingers intertwining with hers. We'll figure out the rest as we go. He kissed her then, gentle and hesitant, like he was afraid she might disappear if he pushed too hard. Eveline kissed him back and felt something inside her finally settle, finally relax, the constant vigilance giving way to something that felt dangerously close to peace. They had time now. Time to learn each other beyond the crisis that had brought them together. Time to build something real on the foundation of everything they'd survived. Time to become the people they'd been fighting to protect. Spring came to the empire slowly, winter reluctant to release its grip. But eventually the snow melted and green things started pushing through frozen ground, and the city began to feel less like a battlefield and more like a place where people actually lived. The tribunal's work continued, but the worst of the purge was over. The empire had lost hundreds of corrupt officials and gained a reputation for actually enforcing its own laws. Trade improved. The military reorganized under leadership that wasn't actively betraying it. People began to believe that maybe their government represented something other than exploitation. It wasn't perfect, it was barely functional, but it was better than what had been. Eveline and Lucienne traveled to Blackthorn that spring to begin renovations. The castle looked different in daylight, less like a tomb and more like a structure that had simply been waiting for someone to care about it. They opened sealed corridors and tore down walls that served no purpose except isolation. Brought in architects and craftsmen and families who needed work. The portrait of the first Duchess, cleaned and restored, the blood finally washed away, was hung in the great hall with a plaque explaining who she was and what she'd done. Not a ghost anymore. Just a woman who'd tried to make things better and died for it. Her sacrifice honored. Her memory preserved. One evening, Eveline stood in the gardens looking out over the cliffs as the sun set. Lucian found her there, moving easily now that his shoulder had healed, and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That we did it. We actually changed something." She leaned back against him. "It cost everything, but we did it. Was it worth it?" Eveline thought about Sterling's sacrifice, about the soldiers who died protecting them, about the first Duchess who'd started this fight, knowing it would probably kill her, about her own transformation from desperate noblewoman to the person she'd become. Yes, it was worth it. Because the alternative was living in an empire where power meant immunity and corruption was just how things worked. Because some things are worth dying for. She turned in his arms to face him. And some things are worth living for too. They stood together as darkness fell over Blackthorn. Two people who'd been broken by their world and had somehow managed to rebuild themselves into something stronger. The castle around them was being transformed from a monument to grief into a refuge for hope. The empire beyond was learning that justice could actually mean something real. It wouldn't last forever. Nothing did. Eventually, new corruption would take root, new tyrants would rise, new battles would need fighting. That was the nature of power and the weakness of human systems. But for now, in this moment, they'd won something real, had proven that change was possible if you were willing to pay its price, had honored the dead by refusing to let their sacrifices be meaningless. Months later, when the first families arrived at Blackthorn to start rebuilding their lives, Eveline stood with Lucienne to greet them. She saw their faces, worn down by loss and betrayal, afraid to hope but desperate for any chance at something better, and recognized herself in them. Recognized everyone who'd ever been crushed by systems designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. "Welcome to Blackthorn," she told them. "This is a place for second chances, for learning that survival isn't the same as living, for discovering that you're stronger than the things that tried to break you." The families settled in slowly, cautiously, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But weeks passed, and then months, and gradually they began to believe that maybe this was real, that maybe they actually were safe here, that maybe the empire had changed enough that places like this could exist. The Grand Duchess, who'd once been mocked as a desperate second wife, became known as the woman who'd torn down an empire's corruption and rebuilt something better from its ruins. The Grand Duke, who'd been called a monster, became known as the man who'd channeled his grief into justice instead of revenge. Together they became a symbol of what the empire could be, flawed and scarred and still fighting to be better than what it had been. Years passed. The tribunal finished its work. The empire stabilized under reform systems that weren't perfect, but were at least honest about their imperfections. Eveline and Lucienne grew older together, their partnership deepening into the kind of love that came from truly knowing someone and choosing them anyway, scars and all. On quiet evenings, they would sit together in the restored castle and remember everything they'd survived to get here. The blood and fire and impossible choices. The people they'd lost and the people they'd saved. The price they'd paid and the world they'd bought with it. And sometimes, when the light hit right through the windows of the Great Hall, they would stand before the portrait of the first Duchess and silently thank her for starting what they'd been able to finish. For believing the empire was worth saving even when everyone else had given up on it. The ghosts that had haunted Blackthorn were finally gone. Not exorcised or forgotten, but honored and laid to rest. The castle was alive again, full of voices and laughter and the sounds of people building futures instead of mourning pasts. Eveline Marrow had come to Blackthorn, a desperate woman with no options and nothing to lose. She'd become a Grand Duchess, a tribunal judge, a symbol of resistance against corruption. But more than any of that, she'd become someone who understood that power's true measure wasn't in how you dominated others, but in what you chose to build with it. She'd learned that monsters were just people who'd forgotten how to be anything else. That redemption was possible if you were willing to face what you'd done and choose differently. That love could grow in the scorched earth left behind by trauma if you gave it time and tended it carefully. She'd learned that justice wasn't a destination, but a constant fight. That corruption would always try to regrow. That vigilance was the price of anything worth protecting. Most importantly, she'd learned that when you stopped running from the darkness and turned to face it, you discovered you were stronger than you'd ever imagined. That survival was a skill. That choosing hope over despair was an act of rebellion all its own. On the day that would have been the first Duchess's 30th birthday, Eveline and Lucienne stood together in the castle gardens and planted a tree in her memory. An oak that would grow tall and strong and live for centuries, rooted in the same soil where so much blood had been spilled. "This is for you," Eveline said quietly to the woman she'd never met but owed everything to. "For starting a fight you couldn't finish. For believing we were worth saving. For teaching us that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to give up even when the world gives you every reason to quit." The tree would grow. The castle would endure. The empire would continue its slow, stumbling progress towards something better. And two people who'd been broken by grief and desperation would live the rest of their lives knowing they'd made a difference. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There was no happily ever after, no magical resolution that erased all problems and tied everything into a neat bow. Life was messier than that, more complicated, more real. But it was an ending that honored what had been sacrificed, an ending that proved change was possible, an ending that left the world slightly better than it had been found. And sometimes that was enough. Evelyn stood with Lucien as the sun set over Blackthorn one final time, painting the sky in colors that looked like hope and fire mixed together. She thought about the girl she'd been, desperate and afraid and willing to sell herself to save her brother. Thought about the woman she'd become, scarred and strong and unwilling to let anyone suffer the way she had if she could prevent it. The journey between those two people had nearly killed her a dozen times over, had cost her peace and safety and the comfortable illusion that the world was fundamentally just. But it had also given her purpose, partnership, and the bone-deep certainty that she was capable of more than she'd ever imagined. "Do you have any regrets?" Lucien asked, reading her thoughts the way he'd learned to do over years of intimacy. Evelyn considered the question honestly, thought about all the pain and blood and impossible choices, thought about Sterling's sacrifice and the soldiers who'd died and the families torn apart by the Empire's corruption, thought about the cost of justice and the weight of survival. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret fighting. I don't regret surviving. I don't regret becoming someone strong enough to finish what needed finishing." She looked up at him. "Do you?" Lucien was quiet for a moment. Then, "I regret failing my first wife. I regret the years I wasted in grief instead of action. But I don't regret anything that came after you walked through Blackthorn's gates. You gave me a reason to be more than my pain." They stood together as darkness claimed the sky and stars began to emerge one by one. Two people who'd been forged in fire and blood into something unbreakable. Two people who'd learned that the strongest bonds were formed not in ease and comfort, but in shared struggle and mutual survival. The Empire beyond would face new challenges and new corruption. The work of justice would never truly end. But they'd proven it was possible to fight and win, to tear down powerful systems and rebuild them into something better. They'd proven that ordinary people pushed to their limits could become extraordinary, that desperation could transform into strength, that choosing to stand when everything told you to run was its own kind of heroism. The castle behind them glowed with light and life. No longer a tomb, but a sanctuary. The gardens around them bloomed with flowers that would die and return each year, a natural cycle of death and rebirth that mirrored their own transformation. The cliffs beyond stood eternal and indifferent, witness to everything that had happened here. And in the great hall, the portrait of the first Duchess watched over it all with eyes that seemed almost alive in candlelight, a permanent reminder that some fights were worth the cost, some truths were worth dying to protect, and some people refused to be forgotten no matter how hard the powerful tried to erase them. The Grand Duke and his second Duchess walked back into Blackthorn hand in hand, leaving the ghosts of the past behind them, ready to face whatever tomorrow brought with the certainty that they would face it together. The story that had begun with death and desperation ended with life and purpose. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but honestly, which was worth more than any comfortable lie. And that, in the end, was all anyone could really ask for.